Because you're going to start with the Q&A? No, I'm going to respond. Okay. Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, exactly. I have not been in the same.
Yeah, okay, there we go. Okay. Good evening, and welcome here in person and also via live stream. Tonight we are celebrating the launch of Donald Stoesz's book, Transformative Moments in Chaplaincy. I'm grateful that Donald is here from Alberta and has invited Ken Kuhn and Bernie Mullins as guest presenters tonight. Welcome to you and welcome to everyone. My name is Arlen. I am the director at Common Word, a national Anabaptist bookstore and library jointly operated by Mennonite Church Canada and Canadian Mennonite University, where it's possible to buy or borrow or access resources online. It's our privilege to be hosting tonight's conversation about prison chaplaincy, how God has been at work through restorative justice efforts, the important pioneering ministry of Pierre and Judy Allard, and the reconciliation work in Rwanda, among other things. Donald's book weaves together these three moments and movements of the Spirit. Before I introduce our guests, I invite us to begin by acknowledging that we here in Winnipeg live as treaty people in the territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Métis, and Ojibwe Cree nations. We gather in Treaty 1 territory, benefit daily from Treaty 3 water and Treaty 5 hydroelectricity. Those of you on live stream may be joining us from other sacred lands. We make this acknowledgement in respect for our host peoples who have and continue to love and care for the land. And we are grateful for a growing circle of relationships between Indigenous and settler peoples and communities, and hopeful because greater commitments and deeper understandings are being made to foster reconciliation. A couple of quick notes. For those who are participating online, I invite you to send a chat message with your name and general location so we have a sense of who is joining us. Thank you. This conversation is being recorded and will be kept online at commonword.ca for future viewers. After the presentations, there will be time for questions and responses, and online viewers can submit their comments via the chat function, and I will try to monitor that. After the formal part of this event, Transformative Moments in Chaplaincy will be available to purchase in person at Common Word. I will open the store, or online at commonword.ca. And I will include a link to the book in the chat. For those here in person, please take some time to peruse some other titles on the tables and in the store that Donald has brought, other titles that he himself has written, and to have him sign your purchased copies. Take some time to chat with Sheila Clausen-Wiebe or John Bupolin, professors at CMU, about their CMU's new Masters of Arts program in spiritual care. And be sure to check out the art exhibit, the juried art exhibit on the table there, presented in partnership with the Manitoba Multifaith Council and sponsored by Mennonite Church Manitoba. It's the outcome of this year's Manitoba Corrections Chaplaincy Art Contest. Now, allow me to introduce our guests. Donald Stoesz has worked for 35 years as a prison chaplain within the federal service in Quebec and in Alberta. He has, as I said, written several books on prison chaplaincy, including A Theology of Prison Ministry, a prison chaplaincy manual, in addition to this present volume we're celebrating tonight. Donald is married to Naomi Brubaker. They have 4 children and 3 grandchildren, all living in Alberta. Ken Kuhn is a retired Lutheran pastor and former Protestant chaplain at Stony Mountain Institution, a federal prison just north of Winnipeg. He served congregations in Calgary and Vancouver and as the campus pastor at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. He has served on the boards of the Commission for Justice and Peace of the Canadian Council of Churches, the Church Council on Justice and Corrections, and for 15 years on the Manitoba Multifaith Council's Justice and Corrections Committee, of which he is currently the interim chair. Bernie Mullins is a chaplain from Brandon, where he has ministered in a provincial correctional facility center for the past 25 years. And since 2008 has concurrently served as the chaplaincy coordinator for Manitoba Corrections. Bernie has also worked as a chaplain in the Corrections Service of Canada, Pacific Region, and is endorsed by the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Winnipeg. He is married to Sharon and enjoys photography, hiking, and camping with his stepson. we're in for a good conversation. Thank you for joining us, and welcome. I invite Ken forward, please.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Arlen, for your hospitality here and for hosting this book launch and for facilitating Dawn, who has come from Alberta, to be with us this evening. And thank you all for coming. We kind of have a sign-up sheet kind of near the door. If you're able to give your name and email, then every week we will send you a request for donations. And 10 years after you die, the donation, request will still go out. No, quite frankly, we are trying to network among people who might be friends of prison work in order to just get some feedback on your opinions about what might be some priorities, especially for the Justice and Corrections Committee that primarily supports the provincial chaplains and also has some connection with the federal chaplains and some connection with some of the agencies in Winnipeg and throughout Manitoba that support those who come from our prisons back into the community, because most of those who are incarcerated, who have had offenses, they eventually come back into the community. And the hope is that with chaplaincy and other services, that it will not be a time of punishment, but will be a time of rehabilitation, a time to help them to grow in their knowledge of themselves and in their behaviors as well. So that is one of the larger missions that we are having to undergird by this book launch today. When I was younger, I lived in Burnaby, a suburb of Vancouver, and now and then I would drive to New Westminster, and in New Westminster was the BC Pen. We called it the BC Pen at that time, a federal prison that looks an awful lot like Stony Mountain Institution, a real old-fashioned, kind of prison. And in my youth, sometimes in my adulthood, when we drove by there, I would get a chill up my spine. And then God called me in a kind of a diverse way to work in a prison. So I'm just going to ask you right now, when you hear the word prison or drive by a prison, like you do maybe going to the lake up on Highway 7 north of Winnipeg, what's a feeling that you have? Can you just right now just speak up a word that comes to your mind when you go by a prison or when you hear the word prison?
Lonely.
Okay? More?
Poor women.
Okay, very good, thank you.
Danger.
Okay, very good. Yes, thank you. Come on.
Sadness.
Dig deep.
Sadness.
Yes, okay. Other.
Empathy for the staff.
Yes, okay, very good. Thank you. Yep. Okay, thank you very much. So, one of the things that we want to accomplish today is to share a little bit about the approach of restorative justice. I think when people, read the newspaper this past week, that Winnipeg has the most crime than any city in Canada right now. That's a real concern, and that causes us to have despair, causes us to have some fear. For an old guy like me, should I be driving down Main Street, after midnight? Well, I don't do that very often, that's for sure. So the idea that is popular in the larger society, I think, a variety of opinions, but usually punishment. The solution to crime is punishment. That there's a concern with separating people from the community so they will not bother us. But the biblical vision is one of restorative justice. That those who have broken laws and have offended other people are not just breaking the law, but they are breaking relationships. They're broken relationships. So restorative justice offers a vision of healing, not punishment, but healing. Not separation from the community, but re-entry into the community is the vision. And I think this is one of the themes in Don's book. And he focuses on the careers of Pierre Allard and his wife, Judy. Pierre was the Director General of the Federal Chaplaincy for a number of years. He was my boss for a number of years when I was at Stoney. And he and his wife have gone on from Canada, from introducing community chaplaincies and then influencing the correctional system of Canada to be more holistic in its operations, and then have gone on to Rwanda in recent years, where there was a terrible massacre in 1994, and is introducing offender-victim reconciliation, working with offenders, seeing if they would be willing to meet some of the victims of that massacre. So this is a very redemptive thing that we are about. Just one note that in Canada we have federal prisons, we have provincial prisons. The main difference is that the federal prisons have housed those who have been convicted of longer crimes, and those for shorter crimes, 2 years less a day, are provincial prisons. So Stony Mountain is the only federal, well, not the only one in Manitoba, and Headingley and Milner Ridge and the Remand Center downtown are provincial institutions. So with these opening remarks, I'd just like to invite Donald, who is driven from Alberta, to visit with family, and also to share his book, and probably wants us to buy books if we might be interested in that. So let's give him a big hand this evening. Good. Okay. Thanks again.
Yes, thank you very much, Ken. Just like to thank Arlen. First of all, thank you very much for hosting this and promoting the book. I mean, it was wonderful to work with you, and I'm going to do this every year now at about September 26th, so I have 2 more already, so just so you know. I mean, they're probably more boring, but whatever. And thank you for the Folio Cafe for help yourself to coffee later. And there's my sister brought, and her husband brought some fruits and tall grass prairie. Lord. Brought some scones and treats, so please finish them. Otherwise, we have to take them home. So thank you very much. I'm just going to concentrate on some themes in the book. That's all. I mean, there's lots of things I could say. I'll start with a story. So for those of us who know Pierre Allard, he gave me his doctoral thesis in a spiral binder about 20 years ago, and he thought I'd read it. So I put it on my shelf for 20 years. And it was only after I retired, or I retired recently, is that I went back to that doctoral thesis. It was published in 1986, just when he was, just before he became National Director. He worked closely with the Correctional Service Canada, Commissioner Ole Ingstrup on a mission statement. And it was a very, very interesting book. And I'm just going to emphasize the theological points that he made in that book, which actually I didn't know that I believed in all of that until I read it. So he says 3 things. First of all, we've all been created in the image of God, and we're God's creatures. The second thing is that biblical justice has to do with restorative justice, not punitive justice. That means God has established a relationship with us in a covenantal relationship with the people of Israel, with the Christians, or with all of us. And when we break that covenant, God's intention is to restore that covenant relationship with us. The third theme he mentioned was that there is a wall of hostility between inmates and society, and he chose Ephesians 3:20 as an example. And Paul, I like Paul. I know he's not really that popular in some circles, but Paul crossed between the pagan Greek, non-believing or pagan or gods believing Greek culture and the biblical Hebrew people that were in Judea. And so Ephesians 3 talks about the fact that there is a wall of hostility. I think we have to be clear about that. The harm that has been caused by the guys who are incarcerated and the hurt that victims have experienced is real. And in fact, the more you work with that, the more you become aware of how real that is. Whether from people who are picketing in front of penitentiaries or coming to parole hearings, making victim impact statements, regardless. And some of us may here in this room been harmed and have been hurt by people who offended against us. So we have to always be aware of that. So that's his third point. And the fourth point he makes is that it is possible for reconciliation to happen. And then Paul talks about Jesus Christ breaking down that wall of hostility in Ephesians, goes on in 2 Corinthians 5 and following to talk about the fact that we can become a reconciliation ministry. So that was the reason I wrote the book. I called it Celebrating 50 Years of Ministry of Pierre and Judy Allard. And for those of us who have met them, they're kind of unforgettable. So it's hard to forget them. So that was really what I did. They've been in Rwanda for the last 15 years. And Pierre is deaf and has a lot of health problems, and Judy does too, but they've been gone back to Rwanda the last, from 2006, so that's 18 years. And so a lot of email things. Anyway, where was I? So that was my title, so I wrote a book about, what he had done and Judy had done and this and that. And then after I had almost finished the book, all ready to go, January of last year, a year and a half ago, Pierre emailed me. He says, well, Don, I'm sorry the bad news. That was what the subject. He says, I'm sorry, I forgot to check with my wife whether you could put my picture on the front cover. In fact, you can't have it about me at all. We are just serving in the name of the Lord, and there's biblical passages we could use about that service. You've probably seen some of those, and that's all that's necessary. And you have to make it wider. And so I already knew that he was going to tell me this. I already knew that this was coming. So I had already done 2 chapters on community chaplaincy. I thought, thank you, Pierre. So I'll put you in chapter 3 and 4 instead of 1 and 2 there. So it's perfect. So what I find providential, the second title I came up with was Up from the Grassroots, which actually had very little to do with Pierre and Judy. It had to do with Charles Taylor in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, and Spring Hill. It had to do with, Pierre and Judy in terms of Moncton, their coffee house inviting ex-offenders on Friday night, the Halifax Community Chaplaincy Association, the Kingston Chaplain Association, Reverend Matthews. He asked his church for gas money to go to Kingston, Penn, and back to visit the guys. We think of Elmira, the 2 parole officers that started Restorative Justice, that is still going in Waterloo. In Winnipeg, Open Circle, Clarence Sepp and Henry Dewick, a lot of people doing M2W2. Orville Andrews in the early 70s with 7 volunteers in Prince Albert. Graham Braddock with MCC in Drumheller in Alberta. And then the M2W2 program in Abbotsford, Harry Now kind of followed that. So that is really, it's providential because they all sprang up because we believed in change. And we believed in the possibility of change, a kind of idealism, and that's what my first 2 chapters are on. The next 2 chapters then are on Pierre's vision and how he established that within institutional chaplaincy. And then the last 2 chapters are his Rwanda experience. And it's interesting, he and Judy became, he was president of the International Prison Chaplaincy Association in 1995. Judy was the executive director, and they planned 3 international chaplaincy events. And there's people here who were at the 2000 International Conference in South Africa, right, Ken? You were there. I couldn't afford it, by the way, just so you know. Bo, you were there, and Joan was there. So, and then he planned one in Kingston here and in Elmira, Quebec. So that was the 5 terms. 1995 he did one, 2000 he did one, 2005 he did one. And because of that, they were invited to Rwanda. You know, so that's an interesting thing. And the first thing they did was visit the prisons. That's a very interesting thing. I mean, you know, and it was a providential time because the inmates had already done 13 years of prison time. There were thousands of inmates had already done the incarceration from 1994 to 2006. That's 12 years, I guess. And so they were preparing to be released back into the villages in which they had come. So there was a lot of tension in a little bit in terms of how is this going to work. And so Pierre and Judy were there at, again, a third providential time. I'm arguing there's 3 kairotic moments. Kairos talks about a small window of opportunity when change can happen, a small window. Boom, it's over. So there's only a small window, I would say, that all happened. Anyway, that's my theory. So then they were in Rwanda. They asked the prisoners whether they would want to write a letter of apology. Very simple. That's all they asked. Are you sorry for what you did? Do you want to write a letter asking for forgiveness? And so the Rwandan chaplaincy team spent 10 years, from 2006 to 2016, delivering these letters, 450 letters. Took 10 years, a long time. And out of these 450 letters, 250 victims, well, I mean, there were a lot of victims who accepted the letters, and then they had to make a decision, do I actually want to continue or reply? It doesn't necessarily mean forgiveness. It means, in grief recovery, we talk about strong emotional responses to people that have died that we've loved. That doesn't mean that we always can forgive them maybe what they've done to us. But there is a sense in which we can deal with that and come to terms with it. Anyway, that's a long process. So the victims had to make a decision. And it's interesting, I believe in self-interest, that they were interested not only in, let's say, giving out forgiveness. They wanted to know, well, how did my parents die? How did my brothers, did you bury them? Did you throw them in the river? Who were they? Who are you? And one couple found out that the person who had killed her family was the stepson they had raised for 10 to 15 years. And they had no idea that he was the one that did it. He was a Hutu. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. So there was a sense of self-interest that there's a mutuality that's going on in the reconciliation process. And that it's not a guaranteed outcome. The offenders who feel remorseful maybe won't show it in the way that the victim thought, and the victim may respond in ways that the offender didn't realize. And there's often debriefing processes that go on both with the offender and the victim, in terms of how it went, etc. But anyway, that's my story. I'm sure I'm over 10 minutes, right, Violet? All right, I'm good.
Good evening and thank you. And I'd like to take a moment to respond to Don and reflect a little on what he shared with us and what's in the book. It is an honor to do this, and Don has undertaken an important task, which is to tell the story of Pierre Allard, and I know Pierre didn't want to be the center of it, but I don't know how we could do that otherwise. And to some extent, the story of chaplaincy itself. And this is important because unless these stories are documented and preserved, we risk losing them. And they are stories worth hearing. The work of corrections is huge. It's a massive undertaking, and chaplaincy is a small part of this activity, often requiring minimal resources and generating little fanfare. However, what prison ministry offers, the benefits, if I could put it that way, especially in the hope that many receive as a result of their contact with chaplains, volunteers, and others, this is immeasurable. And if I could just detour for a moment, hearing the stories of Pierre's work, as well as several others, reminded me of an anecdote from my own start as a chaplain. I remember it very well. It was February 1995, and I was sitting in a room in the Correctional Service of Canada's Pacific Regional Headquarters in Abbotsford, British Columbia, and I was waiting to be called in for an interview as a chaplain. Now, I arrived there with a little bit of education that was largely untested by any real pastoral experience, let alone the kind that comes from the crucible of practicing prison ministry. And the board was running a little behind, so to ease my already heightened anxiety, I tried to distract myself by scanning the room. And I caught a glimpse of this picture frame in front of me, and it was the CSC mission statement. And I read it. And I found it inspirational. It was the last thing I expected to find in a government office. And that became for me what Don described as the Kairos moment. Because despite my lack of knowledge and experience and minimal training, I began to imagine what prison ministry might look like. Well, the interview started, and that's when I met Pierre Allard, who was the author of that statement. And on a personal note, I can't say what a privilege and honor it was to be a prison chaplain in the Allard era. Now, I first heard of the evening's other significant theme, restorative justice, during the early years of my prison ministry experience. And at that time, despite the fact that restorative justice had been around for several years, it was finally gaining momentum and recognition as a viable and worthwhile way of addressing the impact of crime beyond the traditional punitive approach. However, in the middle of the 90s, we didn't have a book like this, and we didn't fully know or understand how restorative justice was being used in the criminal justice system. We had a little picture in our own backyard, but certainly not from across the country. And that lack of understanding prompted a fellow chaplain to make a comment. He said, "This restorative justice stuff, it sounds great, but I gotta ask, restore to what?" How we might respond to that question largely depends on how one does restorative justice, which is now practiced in a variety of ways by different service providers, non-governmental agencies, and has become government policy in many jurisdictions. And many of the faith-based restorative justice programs that continue to operate today had their start in another era. And several are evolving past the faith-based identity by adopting a secular vision statement or sense of who they are. Few new correction-specific faith-based initiatives are emerging. I'm not saying none, but not as many as years gone by. And if I come from the Maritimes, so if I could use a bit of a marine metaphor, it might seem that the faith community is sitting at the wharf, at the dock, fondly gazing outward as the good ship Restorative Justice, a ship it once helped to build and launch, sails far away to other lands with new masters at the helm. So where does that leave the faith community? Chaplains, faith-based organizations, as we operate in a secular world. Some might wonder if faith-based initiatives really have a place in restorative justice, or is this just an artifact from a bygone era? And especially in light of the significant challenges that face contemporary Christians, like declining membership in our churches, the challenge of relating to the secular world in a time of post-Christendom, and of course the tremendous reckoning that is underway as we seek reconciliation with our Indigenous brothers and sisters. I believe that the brilliance of Pierre's vision that Don has given voice to helps us understand that question, which is why restorative justice is relevant to today's faith-based and chaplaincy communities. In his book, Don stated, and I quote, "Pierre Allard's emphasis on the fact that inmates have been created in the image of God represents a crucial aspect of prison chaplaincy. The programs, the services, and the activities that we now call restorative justice are in some way forms or representations of what emerged from a vision. Let us not underestimate the breadth and depth of where that vision might lead us. For Pierre, this vision that began in Canada took him to another continent. Who could have imagined that it was possible for some semblance of peace and reconciliation to emerge from a conflict like the Rwandan genocide by using the principles of restorative justice? Perhaps the challenge for today's chaplains and faith-based leaders is to ask what new forms of restorative justice might emerge from Pierre's vision that itself comes from a more complete biblical justice. Well, that's a question for another day, but I would like to conclude with a few thoughts. Wherever the vision takes us, it means working beside and in concert and not in competition with our brothers and sisters from other faith communities, be they Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, or any other faith community representative who seeks to bring a message of hope and mercy to their kin and community. Don highlighted the multi-faith approach to chaplaincy in his book as well. And here in Manitoba, as Ken noted, the Manitoba Multifaith Council offers important leadership by bringing together many diverse voices of faith. It means that we take seriously the work of reconciliation with our Indigenous brothers and sisters who are vastly overrepresented in Canada's justice system. There is much wisdom within the traditional cultures about becoming understanding what is justice, and there is much we can learn from them. And finally, it means adapting a worldview that might be expressed by the Jesuit priest Greg Boyle, who called for, and I quote, "a compassion that can stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at the way they carry it." Prison ministry is a ministry where many began with a motivation to bring Christ to the prisoners, but quickly discovered a deeper and more profound mystery, which is seeing the face of Christ in the prisoner. And this is more than a new perspective, but a glimpse of a new vision that is Pierre's vision. And perhaps that is why prison chaplains and volunteers have become so dedicated to the work. which is a story that needs to be told. And I want to sincerely thank Don for his excellent work to bring this story alive to us this evening. You do us all proud. Thank you, and good evening. So at this moment, we're going to have an opportunity for Q&A, and I believe a mic is coming forward. So if you have a question, I'll facilitate the Q&A, but please use the mic for the benefit of those who are online, as well as all of us in the room.
I guess I've had some, my name is Chris Halady, attend St. Mark's Lutheran Church. The question of Paul in Scripture is a huge one, for he was one who followed the law and followed all the Jewish laws without blemish, and yet he persecuted Jesus' followers. From that, Paul basically created Christianity, along with John. And but restorative justice in that sense, really is the question, is Paul redeemable for his actions? He did terrible things. Terrible, terrible, terrible things. And yet, he wrote so many brilliant letters that have influenced billions of people. And you sort of have to ask the question, is Paul, formerly Saul, redeemed? And I think that's part of the basis of restorative justice myself, and trying to figure out how we can negotiate better with our Indigenous brothers and sisters when in media, they're saying that what ministers and churches say means nothing compared with their experience. So those are just some thoughts I wanted to share with you, and I'd love to hear your response.
I have a few thoughts, but Don, did you want to?
I just have a story. I worked together with Alcoholics Anonymous volunteers for many years, and we had a roundup at Bowden, and all of the guys, the two speakers came in, were dragging behind an oxygen tank in order to keep going. They had severe health problems, and they were all in their 70s. And I had to ask, so then I got to know one of the guys better, and he was the one that had done terrible, terrible, terrible things in his life. He had been incarcerated for a long time. And he was still trying to make up for what he had done at 75 in the prison system. So that's what I consider reconciliation. And so he told me, he didn't tell everybody that story, and that's all confidential information, but that really helped me understand him better, and he was still trying to atone for what he had done. So.
I think one of the aspects of Paul that people might struggle with is his conversion, and it's something we see in prisons. Inmates will convert in a sudden and almost dramatic manner. One day somebody is XYZ in terms of their behavior, their attitude, and they experience a conversion, and all of a sudden they're made anew. And that's often received with a little bit of suspicion. Really, it's that easy. That's all you had to do. And of course, in the biblical account with Paul, that was the case. However, there's also in the story of Paul, the story of Ananias, who God said, you know, I'm going to send you this guy. He's coming by. I want you to give him some hospitality. His name is Saul. And I don't know what translation of the Bible this is, but Ananias' response was, "Are you nuts? Do you not know who this guy is? Are you crazy?" And so I guess the question is reconciliation, getting to the issues of reconciliation with some of our Indigenous brothers and sisters who look at the more horrific elements of the relationship and say, I don't think so. I think that's a bit of an Ananias perspective. And I don't say that of the Indigenous community, but I kind of wonder if we might look at that as an Ananias perspective. It's like, I don't get this. How can this be? From the later perspective of the communities where Paul has ministered, they're saying, looks good to us, he's authentic. So I guess the question then is, from whose perspective? And where is that leading us? And also, I find it helpful to frame these questions with a bit of a temporal response and say, for right now. This may be difficult right now, maybe not so much in the future, and I think that is the definition, that is the opening for hope. Are there any online questions, maybe? No one's online. That was awkward. Any other questions? Oh, come on, there's got to be a question.
In coffee conversation in the last couple of weeks, I've heard about Finland. I think it's Finland, where the prisons apparently, I look to the experts for comment, are more like campuses where they provide education and every possible resource, sort of like wraparound care, so that they can make a change. But the underlying attitude is not, despite the pain, not that these people are bad and we can barely tolerate anything to help them, but these people missed something along the way and we're going to fill the gap, something like that. Mm-hmm. So I've been curious about that.
Certainly the Nordic experience is quite exceptional. In the book, Don mentions, and Don could probably speak a little bit more of this, Ole Ingstrup, who was the Commissioner of the Correctional Service of Canada, who came from Denmark, wasn't it? Or Denmark, and certainly brought a different perspective. Certainly, the attitudes of the community will influence the decision makers who have a role in creating the policy, and when implemented is often reflected in the design of prisons. Certainly, the experience of the Nordic communities is perhaps different. I'm not really. I don't have a lot of in-depth knowledge of the Nordic experience. Don, do you have any? No? Yeah. But I guess a fair point to say that around the world, there are certainly different models.
Stigma is a big issue. I think of the 19th century of the mental health institutions that were fortresses, and there was a fairly large stigma to have a mentally ill child. And I think society has done a reasonably good job of trying to deinstitutionalize that. And I use that as an example, that if we look at Canadian society, maybe the deinstitutionalization of mental health, and that it's not a stigma in that sense. There's still some real issues of mental health, And crime and punishment is always a big topic. I mean, just look at all the TV shows that TVs love crime and punishment. So come on, it's a growth industry. But I think it's a stigma issue. And if the stigma can be kind of, visiting prison is just normal once a week or something, it's a way of kind of normalizing life. And I think by separating prisoners from society, they become abnormal and are awfulized, I guess, in some way in society, then become a dualism. And to decrease that duality in some senses. Anyway, that's just an example. Not a Nordic.
Are you finding support from the correctional system in your, let's say, first of all, faith-based ministry to wards of the state, a secular state, and then in particular, does the correctional system foster, welcome restorative justice approaches, or are you finding tension or resistance on the part of the correctional system to restorative justice approaches today?
My own personal experience is that the administrators and the policymakers that I've had contact with have been incredible and have really grasped a sense of what chaplaincy is, why it's important, and have been incredibly supportive. Again, that's my own personal experience. In terms of restorative justice, it's a tough one to answer. I mean, certainly restorative justice is becoming much more embraced. I think it's harder to do restorative justice in a facility than in a community, because I think when you look at the examples that Don gives in the book, where are the restorative justice programs? They're on the receiving end, right? It's when people return to the community. What sort of reception will they be offered, right? And I think one of the incredible examples of this is circles of support and accountability. The whole, a couple of years ago, Harry Nye, a Mennonite pastor who many of you have probably heard of, came to Winnipeg to deliver a presentation, and it's up online somewhere on YouTube, and tells the amazing story of a gentleman who was being released into the community. The reception he was getting was really quite hostile. He was considered to be a danger, a risk, and his community, his Mennonite community, did something quite radical. They offered not just hospitality, but also accountability, and embraced him in a way that sent a message that you are welcome, but you are also accountable. And that is spread across Canada, and obviously, one of the great examples is operating here in Manitoba, Circles of Support and Accountability, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. I think the point being is that a very small fraction of people coming into custody will stay in custody. Most people will return. So I think the more critical question for me is, how are they being received upon their return, right? It's easy to look at the institution because it's out there, they're big, large buildings, very prominent in our community, and it's easy to point to them and say, what's going on in there? I think the more critical question is, what's going on in our communities when people return? And I think that's where the heart of restorative justice is. Did you?
Yeah, but just a note, Correctional Service of Canada.
Mike, yeah.
Correctional Service Canada gives every offender in the federal system an opportunity to participate in a restorative justice opportunity. So that it's done now through the parole office. So then I would often, there are guys who I felt were kind of ready to kind of look at their crime and accountability, that I gave them a long sheet of paper that signed it, and then that was sent initially to Ottawa, then I think, and then that's sent to restorative justice counselors in Alberta. There's 2 that come. And in Bowden, I was sure that every month they would interview maybe 10 to 15 offenders in terms of the process of restorative justice. That means that they would keep talking, and then at some point there may be opportunity. There is a victims unit that they can sign up for. In fact, you have to sign up, register for that within the Correctional Service Canada, and then you are informed of what happens to the inmate if he goes from maximum to medium, released into the community, things like that. And so that process of discussion with the offender, I think, and I've seen that happen a lot, that both sides have to be ready. It takes years. There's some often victim impact statements are very powerful. Within the parole hearings, I've worked with a lot of guys on that to have a more realistic understanding of the harm that they've done. Because there's such a large separation, inmates get a little delusional in some aspects of how they look at the situation, and while victims are often suffering. And so it is a matter of treading lightly a little bit, but I know the counsellors are very actively involved in restorative justice within the Correctional Service of Canada, and Pierre's the one that started it. So.
I have one quick comment on or question online. Just clarification about restorative justice. Is it a multi-faith or strictly a Christian approach?
Yeah, it's interesting. In most of the restorative justice conferences that take place, religion isn't even mentioned. So I'm participating in November in all the workshops. I'm the only one that might talk about faith in that aspect. So I think it's caught on in society, whether we talk about forgiveness, remorse, guilt, shame. That's a universal issue that is dealt with by whether you're religious or not. And I think there's, I'm biased, so I would say the spiritual resources have been very, very prominent in my own life in terms of forgiveness, reconciliation. But I think there are wonderful streams of justice within each tradition that allows people to come back into communities and be restored to communities. So I think that's a universal thing. So.
I think Ken wants to, in the interest of time, wrap it up. I guess if there's one more burning question, just absolutely.
Sorry, just to.
Yep.
Just to argue the Christian perspective point a bit, which is that we acknowledge we are all sinners. Mm-hmm. We are all sinners, and that means none of us are perfect. I like the Ananias response. It's wonderful. The thing is that transition. My nephew has been in prison so many times over the last decade. And I can't, at the moment, forgive him because I know he doesn't acknowledge what he's doing. And until he does, until he has that Kairos moment, I can't. Until he recognizes what he has done is wrong, what he did was wrong, until he changes his whole mindset, until he is, to turn a phrase, born again, I can't forgive him. And that's what I want to see in restorative justice, for people to see that they were enemies of society. And society doesn't make these laws willy-nilly. It makes them because they are very imperative. And, to recognize that you have to live within these laws is a fundamental responsibility of citizenship on this planet. So that's just the one more point I'd like to make.
That's a good point. Wilma Dirksen, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with Wilma's work, I've heard her say that sometimes for victims, forgiveness is the F word. I think even in the book, I noticed, not to critique the book, but Pierre's recollection of his time in Rwanda is a bit different than Joan Palardy, who's a co-author, cited as a co-author. And I think that she's a little more nuanced in how this was received, right? And I think that was an important point. And just when you talked about the theology, I just read chapter 10. It's excellent in terms of the theology. So, but thank you for sharing that. I'm going to invite my friend. I met this guy at Stony Mountain when I thought I could steal his job, but he stuck around for a while. I wanted to get from the Pacific region down into the prairie region, but Ken stuck it out, and glad he did. So,
Thanks so much. I just wanted to thank Dawn. Thanks for her hospitality. If you want to buy a book, or are you going to sign books perhaps as well?
I think Marlon's going to just say a few words.
Oh, you're going to say a few. Okay, you're going to say. Why don't you come up and say a few words, and then I'm going to close with an Aboriginal prayer, because Monday is Truth and Reconciliation Observation Day. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you all for your engagement tonight, and it's been a good conversation. Let's give Dawn and Ken and Bernie our warm appreciation. This conversation, as I've said, has been recorded and is available to view at commonword.ca, where you can buy or borrow the book. And I will open the store momentarily. And to those at a distance, you can order your copy at commonword.ca. And before the final prayer, let me just give a word of closing. May the work of transformation, the work of restoration, the work of reconciliation continue and be present in our correctional facilities, outside our correctional facilities, in the lives of each person inside and outside the prison walls. And where there is hatred, may there be love. Where there is sadness, joy. And where there is despair, ever hope. I wish all of you health and good and safety, and thank you so much for participating, and we'll have a final prayer.
Now, we have a few people here who have been prison chaplains. I wonder if you'd stand up, those of you who've been prison chaplains. So Cease and Hank and Bo and any others who, yes, Greg, and are there persons here who have volunteered and have visited prisons or worked in some of the agencies? Murray, I know. And yes, also okay, good, and you are okay. That's fantastic, and a few people at the back there as well. So, and I think to answer one of the questions that was from an observer online, the question: are there other roots? Is it uniquely Christian? I think we do have to recognize the contribution of the Aboriginal community, in which restorative justice was part of their culture and still is a part of their culture, and the Aboriginal spiritual caregivers in our institutions in the community are almost more successful than we are, especially in Manitoba, where the majority of those in both the provincial and federal systems are of Aboriginal background. So we have much to learn from our Aboriginal community. So for that reason, I found an Iroquois prayer, which we'll have two benedictions this evening. So let us pray together. Creator God, whose voice I hear in the winds, and whose breath gives life to all the world, hear me. I am a human, only a human before you, one of your many children. I'm small and weak. I need your strength and wisdom. Let me walk in beauty and make my eyes ever behold the red and purple sunsets. Make my hands respect the things you have made, my ears sharp to hear your voice. Make me wise so that I may know the things that you have taught my people, the lessons you have hidden in every leaf and rock. I seek strength, O Creator, not to be superior to my brothers or sisters or others, but to be able to fight against my greatest enemy, which is myself. Make me ever ready to come to you with clean hands and straight eye, so that when life fades at the setting of the sunset, my spirit may come to you without shame. And so we say, Megwitch, thank you so much for coming this evening. Thanks again, Don, Bernie, and our bookstore manager. All the best. There's more coffee. Do look at the inmate artwork. And I would like to get your names and addresses just to do a little bit of follow-up with you. And no, you aren't going to ask for money, no, but someone else will do that. Okay. All the best. Have a safe trip home.